Video game development isn't easy. Studios have to constantly chop and change upcoming products right up until their due dates, usually based on what is known to work and what doesn't. When you have hundreds of people working on the same product for years at a time, changing developmental focus is inevitable. But while these differences are usually small and the natural result of production, sometimes a title can change massively from its first unveiling to your first playthrough. Whether it was the result of internal problems or just last-minute eureka moments, some of the industry's most beloved games underwent radical changes before release. I'm Rich from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 ways your favourite games were almost radically different. Number 10. Uncharted 4. When Uncharted 4 was first announced back in 2014, it looked as though Sony had everything in order for Nathan Drake's final outing. Behind the scenes, however, Naughty Dog hadn't even decided whether this was going to be the final entry in the series at all. Revealed in Jason Schreier's book, Blood, Sweat and Pixels, a good chunk of the title was going to involve no shooting at all, with the devs instead putting the focus on platforming, melee combat and stealth, rather than full-blown firefights. Likewise, the story was also going to be altered, with Sam being the main villain. The twist that he was Drake's brother was originally going to be reserved for a later part of the game, in an attempt to drag out the fractured relationship between the two characters. With the sequel not coming together in a way befitting of Naughty Dog's reputation, upper management brought in the directors of The Last of Us to steer the ship, throwing away the majority of the work already completed to craft a new finale to the series. Number 9. Borderlands. When Borderlands was first announced, it looked like any other first-person shooter that came out in the latter half of the 2000s. Featuring the same po-faced, serious tone and lackluster visual design that so many games were trying to emulate at the time, Gearbox Software's iconic FPS completely lacked the character that it does today. However, knowing that so many of its competitors were creating these dreary post-apocalyptic shooters, the team decided to delay the game and attempted to give the title a distinct identity that would set it apart from the likes of Fallout 3 and Rage. Changing the visual design completely to a new cel-shaded look and dropping the serious nature of the story in favour of something more inherently silly and comedic, the new and improved version of Borderlands was able to stick out from a crowd of samey shooters, becoming a beloved new franchise in the process. Number 8. Alan Wake. In development for over 6 years, the Xbox 360 exclusive Alan Wake went through multiple iterations before becoming the cult classic it is today. Originally wanting to create an open-world game after working on the linear third-person action series Max Payne, Remedy built the town of Bright Falls with the idea that the players would be able to freely explore it in mind. Unfortunately, after trying and failing to make the open-world focus of the gameplay work with the linear nature of the storytelling, the devs scrapped the sandbox idea and instead restructured the title around more focused, episodic design inspired by the studio's TV show influences. Weirdly enough though, you can still see the open world DNA of the original iteration in the final release. The ability to drive from one part of a mission to the next seems like a hangover from the original vision, and might indicate that Remedy didn't scrap their sandbox focus as early in development as they initially claimed. Number 7. Halo Combat Evolved. Announced for the Mac back in 1999, yes, the Mac, Bungie's Halo Combat Evolved changed massively in the years between its original unveiling and its eventual release as an Xbox exclusive. While the aesthetic and the world stayed pretty much intact in the transition from Apple to Microsoft, the gameplay itself took on a radical new focus. Originally a third-person action game, somewhere along the line the iconic title switched perspectives to become the FPS we all know and love today. Considering how much Halo shook up the first-person shooter genre with its buttery smooth controls and more streamlined approach to combat, it's strange how late in development this perspective was actually decided on. The impact of the first Halo can't be overstated, and there's no denying that the gaming world will be radically different today if the original third-person Mac-based incarnation of the game ever saw the light of day. Number 6. Prey. Before Prey, insert Simon Miller joke here, was completely rebooted this year, Bethesda was originally going to create a true follow-up to the original 2006 game that continued the franchise story in a new cyberpunk setting. Dropping the fantasy-inspired narrative of the original in favour of a more gritty, bounty-hunting tale, information on the game was difficult to come by after it was sadly cancelled after a few years of development. After developers piped up about this original sequel, one interesting tidbit was that there was going to be a twist where dying didn't result in respawning like in every other game, but was framed as the player coming back as a different clone of the protagonist. Death wasn't just meaningless, and the game was going to reveal your character's true nature by showing you the bodies that you'd racked up over the course of the title near the sequel's finale. Number 5. Destiny. To say that Destiny's development was a turbulent affair is putting it nicely. While the game's core was always similar to what it is today, with a focus on MMO-style gameplay and a shared world single-player design, the story and structure of the game underwent monumental shake-ups until a few months before it hit shelves. The original idea was to give Destiny a story as expansive and intricate as Bungie's Halo games. Taking place across multiple planets with heavy focus on particular characters, the title's narrative wasn't quite shaping up quite how the developers wanted. With only 6 months to release, the management decided to throw the story out completely in favour of patching something else together instead. Instead of having one cohesive story, Bungie split up missions into different sections to create more content. Consequently, certain set pieces were ripped out of their levels to be used later outside of their original context, and entire planets like Mercury were dropped entirely in favour of a smaller scope. Number 4. Resident Evil 4. After the release of Resident Evil 3, Capcom's survival horror franchise was in desperate need of a shake-up. Attempting to revitalize the long-running series, the publisher ordered a bunch of different prototypes for what would become Resident Evil 4, all completely different from one another. Most of these were short-lived, including a prototype that eventually became Devil May Cry, but one came close to being the next installment in the Resident Evil franchise. Sticking with the fixed camera and tank controls of the original, this version of Resident Evil 4 still featured Leon Kennedy, only instead of shooting infected villagers, he was facing off against ghosts and zombies in a haunted mansion. Putting the emphasis on the supernatural rather than biological horror, despite the familiar controls and perspective, this incarnation of Resident Evil 4 would have moved the series far away from its roots. It does sound like quite an entertaining concept, but there's no denying that the actual Resident Evil 4 was a marked improvement on the original effort. Number 3. Grand Theft Auto. If it hadn't been for a glitch during the development of the original Grand Theft Auto, gaming might be radically different today. Originally titled Race and Chase, the first GTA featured none of the over-the-top violence players know and love today, and was instead an attempt to produce an open-world racing game with a heavy emphasis on reckless driving. Casting players as either cops or criminals, the game would have you completing street races with a crime twist. Weirdly though, a glitch during development made the police cruisers constantly ram the players off the road, and the devs realized that escaping the fury of the cops made for a much more enjoyable gameplay experience than pure racing. Deciding to expand on this idea, Race and Chase eventually became Grand Theft Auto, becoming the basis for one of the most popular video game franchises of all time in the process. Number 2. Doom. After shipping Doom 3, id Software began working on a sequel that was going to take the franchise back to a place it hadn't been in years: Earth. Following in the footsteps of Call of Duty, the original idea for the game was a similarly inspired modern military shooter that swapped terrorists out for demons. Dropping both the survival horror elements of Doom 3 and the fast-paced gameplay of the original titles, the then-titled Doom 4 was much more sluggish and slow-paced than any of its predecessors. Featuring the same point-and-click style shooting as COD, the game would have had you fighting as a team of soldiers pushing back against the demonic threat that had invaded Earth over huge action set pieces. Knowing that the series had strayed too far from its roots, the team eventually scrapped this idea completely after trying and failing to make it work for years. It was for the best, however, because what they came up with in its place was one of the greatest first-person shooters in years. Number 1. BioShock Infinite. Although the location and characters of BioShock Infinite remained intact from its initial announcement to its eventual release, the role they played in the story was constantly changed during development. Originally a floating city founded by the US government as a display of power, Columbia was home to an internal struggle that resulted in Comstock, one of the founding fathers, taking control of the city for himself, resulting in a rebel uprising. The majority of the game would have been centered around Booker and Elizabeth fighting their way through the Civil War. Likewise, the gameplay focus was also completely different. Although the general shooting and weapons remained the same, the Skyrail system was originally implemented to quickly traverse the much larger levels compared to what we got in the final game. Elizabeth's tears were also completely different, being used in the initial iteration to aid moral choices, rather than being reduced to the glorified medkit or ammo stashes they were in the final release. And that's our list. What other games had a different identity before we got our hands on them? Let us know in the comments below. News, lists, and articles await over on whatculture.com, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter here. I'm Rich from WhatCulture, and I'll see you soon.